Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center, to this afternoon seminar and book launch of Zhivago Children, The Last Russian Intelligentsia by Vladislav Zubok. It's great to see all of you here and for you to show up in such great number on a Friday afternoon. Delighted to welcome you to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center, as well as the European program, and delighted to co-host this book launch with our Kennan Institute. I think Will is around. Will Pomeranz over there, the Deputy Director, is joining us here as well. This afternoon will be about a special book, and it's a special panel. It's an all alumni, Wilson Center alumni panel, featuring, of course, hi Lena, featuring, of course, Professor Vladislav Zubok, author of Zhivago Children. Familiar to most of you, he has long been involved in the Center's Cold War International History Project and the Kennan Institute. He is currently a professor of history at Temple University, a specialist in Soviet and Russian political and social history, also the Cold War. He has a host of publications to his credit. Let me just mention two award-winning ones: A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union in the Cold War from Stalin to Gorbachev, and Inside the Kremlin's Cold War from Stalin to Khrushchev, both award-winning publications that we launched here at the center, have launched at the center over the years. From his focus on the Cold War and the new Russian evidence on the Cold War from the early books, he has now moved on to social and go ahead. You can come up front. He has now moved on to social and cultural history with his new book on the Russian intelligentsia. We have a distinguished panel of commentators with us as well, both of them also alumni of this institution. Michael David Fox, Professor of History at the University of Maryland in College Park, to my far right. He specializes in the transformation of Russian and Soviet history since the fall of communism, as well as the political, cultural, intellectual history of late imperial Russia and early Soviet Union. He also has, like all of our panelists here today, a long list of publications to his credit. Let me just point out or mention Revolution of the Mind, Higher Learning Among the Bolsheviks, 1918 to 1929. And I guess 20 scholarly articles in leading history and Russian studies journals. He was formerly a scholar, a fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, but has also held positions with the Harriman Institute at Columbia University and elsewhere. Our second commentator is, I'd like to welcome him back too, Eric Lohr, Associate Professor of History at American University and author of Nationalizing the Russian Empire, the Campaign Against Enemy Aliens During World War I. He has also co-edited Hoover Institution, Stanford University online publication, the papers of Grigory Nikolaevich Trubetskoy, and he's co-editor with Marshall Poe of Military and Society in Russian History, 1450 to 1917. His current book projects include a study of citizenship in imperial and revolutionary Russia and a history of World War I and the end of the Russian Empire. Both eminently qualified scholars. With that introduction, let me turn it over to Vlad for some initial remarks about his book, and then to our two commentators. Vlad.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here. It's like every time returning to your family, extended family. It's pretty much like Zhivago's children, and is an extended generation. This is my extended family in this room, and I see many faces of dear friends, and I thank you for being here. And of course, I attribute it mostly not to your interest to my book, but your great interest in Russian culture that keeps attracting many people. I may say that when I check on the Google how the book is doing and looking for various responses, every time I congratulate myself I'm in good company, because I'm in company with Boris Pasternak, Omar Sharif, and other eminent people. Of course, Google gives you misleading role about your own importance, giving you thousands and thousands of hits that are not related to the book. They're all related to Boris Pasternak's immortal novel. So the novel, of course, inspired me, but the book is, and the book begins with the story of the great Russian poet, but then it switches to the story of the extended generation, that is educated people with high education, with interests in culture, that whose lives had been forever shaped by World War II. Some of them older, some of them younger, some of them veterans of the war, some of them are not veterans but growing up, being really children of that war. And that was a defining moment of their existence early on. This group, I must say, from the very beginning, I was, of course, not trying to extrapolate throughout all Soviet Union, all educated groups of the Soviet Union as an infinite variety of experiences. My focal point, my vantage point was Moscow. And a special role of Moscow from, of course, the very start, from the start of the Bolshevik experiment. There's a book coming out about Moscow as a fourth Rome. Moscow had some provided some opportunities that provinces, including, unfortunately, the former glorious capital, St. Petersburg, provinces. Hard to say, but St. Petersburg became a province in the Soviet Union. All those opportunities were reserved mostly for the Muscovites and for educated elites of Moscow. But nevertheless, this book does make some broader suggestions, some broader generalizations encompassing the experience of the entire extended generation who were born in late 20s and during the 30s and even in the early 40s. Why it was a special group? This group was marked by war, by the youth, their own youth and youth of the country. When you look at the population of the Soviet Union after the war, due to immense casualties, you have 50% of the population under 30 and only 10% of the population over 60. It's a shockingly young population. But also the rapid growth of education, because the regime was whatever you can say about it, set the goal of modernization, set the goal of becoming a second superpower, and needed young educated professionals badly, especially after such a war. So those two coincidences already attributed some special features to this generation. Other things that you can mention about them, they were intellectuals, of course, people of knowledge and high culture with a university education, heavily influenced by what you may say the cultural canon of the 19th century Russian culture, especially Russian literature and poetry. And another thing that was, unique to them but not unique to their predecessors was intense, almost passionate curiosity about the outside world that transformed for some into Westernism, for some the curiosity about other parts of the world that could be called the third world, but nevertheless our outward look, intense curiosity, imbibing knowledge like a sponge. And another great feature of this generation that loomed larger and larger to my surprise as I did my research was socialism. That was the generation that grew up under triumphant socialism, and socialism for them was not so much the party proclamations and the party doctrines, it was the realities that gave them unprecedented opportunities. If you look at the curve of the education from 233,000 in 1928 to 3.5 million and growing very fast of professionals with university degrees, that gave them the idea that that was a society that once cleansed from Stalinist sins and Stalinist crimes could be actually something positive and something good to millions of people. Now, the word intelligentsia came in all the time, and it's essentially the search for the identity, in addition to being pro-socialist, in addition to being optimistic, in addition to being post-war generation, that comes up that notion of the old Russian intelligentsia. And I say many confused in their mind the notion of intelligentsia with a more narrow notion of left radical intelligentsia before the revolution. But nevertheless, they began to operate with this great word as in their search for identity, roughly during the 10 years of Khrushchev era. That coincided, of course, with many other exciting developments, growth of the idea of science, technology, technological progress, to such an extent that some of them began to view themselves as a vanguard of society, to the same degree as some Russian intellectuals had done in the 19th century. Very briefly, in my book, I wanted to look at the impact of this last intelligentsia, people who associated themselves with this notion of this imagined community, if I may use the hackneyed word. What was the impact of that group on Soviet Russian history? And several big themes that I tried to deal with, struggled in the book and tried to find some answers to, is their attitude towards the idea of patriotism and nationalism and national identity, and they were badly split. They were so badly split that when they needed mass following among Russian people, I mean ethnic Russian people, they couldn't get one. They couldn't get one, and it's a separate story, very dramatic story that needs to be told. The impact on reforms. Again, I look at both economic reforms. I look at other things, and what comes out is the greatest contribution that some of them did to Russian history is the idea of human rights. Not to mix with other human rights notion in other parts of the world, there was Russian-Soviet idea of human rights. And they turned out to be extremely weak and inept on economic front, which is not to say we are very strong in this, but they perhaps because of their idealism and penchant to look at grow up in a marketless society, they didn't give too much thinking to those things related to private property, how market operates, and how culture or high culture would do once this market is in place. Very quickly, coming to the end of my introduction, why I use this depressing title, The Last Russian Intelligentsia. First of all, I want to be understood correctly. I don't think it's universally depressing thing to think that this phenomenon that was a specific Russian phenomenon of the 19th century in the first half of the 20th, and to an extent even second half of the 20th century, as I argue, why it is over. Maybe it's not all that bad. After all, it's now intellectuals in Russia confront different set of factors. It's not that triad that we deal with when we look at the 19th century. People, narod, government, state, bureaucracy, and intelligentsia is the third component. Now, the society, for everything we know about Russia, is a vastly different society. Plus, I may say one thing I would regret is maybe inevitable, maybe global, but the decline of that canonic notion of high culture. Those great novels, that great poetry, that kept inspiring Russians generation after generation. Now we have on one hand in Russia the onslaught of mass culture, on the other hand postmodernist attempts to dilute, blur the notion of any canonical notion of high culture as such. So to conclude, I would be really, really interested to hear what my distinguished colleagues are here to say, because they are themselves good specialists in Russian and Soviet intellectuals, and let's get straight to this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. Like to go first?
Yes.
Very good.
Well, I'd like to begin with a few words of praise, because I read Zhivago's Children with great pleasure, and it's a work of remarkable breadth.
You speak into the microphone, please.
Yes, it interprets the history of the intelligentsia all the way from essentially the late Stalin period to post-communism, interpreting its renewal in the 1950s and then its decline. And it's notoriously hard to write about the intelligentsia, precisely because it was less a sociological group, as Marxism, Leninism, and Soviet scholarship decreed, but more a shared mentality and ethos and group identity, as Zubok well knows. And in this book, I think he has found an ingenious way to discuss the collective biography of the intelligentsia that reemerged in the thaw. He relies on the mountains of memoirs and diaries and so-called ego documents that have emerged and been published since the fall of communism, focusing above all on the people, the key figures, their outlook and their experiences, and then he places those figures into the context of successive landmark events and processes that led to the rebirth of a new civic consciousness in the 1950s. So while he really starts with the experience of World War II, and he also contextualizes that story along the way with his knowledge of cultural policy, for which he relies on archival documents. And in the process, he ranges across all sorts of fields, from literature and cinema and theater to the study of international relations, to cybernetics, even to chess. I found that was one of the most interesting moments for me. But the parallels that emerge across culture, society, and politics, I think, are one of the most important achievements of Zubok's synthesis. The price of great breadth is always a certain lack of depth, but in this case it's mitigated, I think, because the author is extremely well informed on a huge array of topics. He is a tenacious researcher who knows how to present new material within the context of a broader narrative, and this book does fill a major gap in the historical scholarship. Zhivago's Children is a model of history that is at once scholarly and accessible to a broad audience. Now, since we are at the Cold War International History Project, I want to start by observing that one of the intriguing aspects of the work that the author did not touch upon has to do with the interconnections between Soviet external relations and domestic processes. For example, the ambitiousness and remarkable overconfidence of Khrushchev's cultural diplomacy led to a series of fateful openings to the West, most notably the extraordinary mass exhilaration of the Moscow World Youth Festival in 1957. And the flip side of this coin was Khrushchev's humiliation after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Zubok argues prompted him to crack down on the intelligentsia, which was another fateful development. Far too few historians in the field have thought systematically about this potent internal-external nexus in Soviet history. And Zubok, given his long-standing expertise in Soviet foreign policy, is qualified, uniquely qualified to do so, and I hope he will continue to take up the challenge. In particular, one sees parallels between Zubok's stress on the power of ideology and ideas in foreign policy in his book Failed Empire, and the stress here on the importance of the intelligentsia to understanding the Soviet collapse in 1991. Zubok tells not just the familiar story of an evolution among the intelligentsia from a largely optimistic and reformist, pro-reformist, still socialist, loyal intelligentsia to disillusioned cynics and opponents. Rather, he stresses that while the intelligentsia, when the intelligentsia came alive under perestroika, its peculiar ethos and past, as well as what he mentioned earlier about the deep split between humanistic left and nationalist right-wing camps, helped channeled perestroika into fatal directions. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects of Russian and Soviet history is how similar phenomena reoccur in vastly different times, across different centuries, across different regimes, across revolutions. And running like a red thread through this book is one of the mysteries of Russian history. How did something so similar to the 19th century intelligentsia, with its intense preoccupation with the so-called cursed questions, its moral fervor, its civic courage, its commitment to the power of enlightenment, its belief in itself as a vanguard force, its belief in the power of culture to change Russia's fate, how did all this reemerge after the unprecedented horrors of Stalinism and the ideological controls of Stalinism? Now, because this work is more a narrative history than an analytical history, this riddle is addressed, like the internal-external nexus that I mentioned earlier, in the course of the entire book, not in any single one place. So let me try to sum up what I think the book's findings are here. First, Zubok shows very concretely in how certain intelligentsia traditions were passed during and especially after Stalinism through key survivors and links to the past, most notably Ilya Ehrenburg and Boris Pasternak. Secondly, in a different kind of transmission, the old Bolsheviks themselves had come out of the radical wing of the old intelligentsia, and the 1950s involved a rediscovery of early Soviet culture of the 1920s. And third, there were what you might call sociological continuities. The old intelligentsia had faced czarist authoritarianism and censorship by developing the tightly knit, intense circles, or kruzhki. And these were succeeded in the 20th century by what he writes a lot about, the kompania, or groups of friends, which were not dissimilar from the old kruzhki. And these reemerged, especially in the post-war era. Fourth, it was greatly, very important that the anti-capitalist cultural policies of the Soviets preserved a very prominent place for literature and high culture. Even the most conservative phases in Stalinist culture still continued to reproduce mass publications of the intelligentsia classics of the 19th century, which took on new meanings in thaw-era cinema and theater. And finally, alienation from of the educated elites from the regime in both eras played its role. And in both cases, you have enlightened, what are called in the period of the great reforms of the 19th century, enlightened bureaucrats. Zubok calls these figures enlightened apparatchiki, figures in the state who sympathized with the intelligentsia and were related to them. So those are some of the means which of continuity. But at the same time, the intelligentsia that reemerged in the 20th century was, it came back in a vastly different society and historical epoch. And as the book shows, physicists and the technical intelligentsia were arguably even more important than poets in the civic revival of the 1950s and after. There were big differences, but in the 19th century there was a veritable cult of the people, the narod, so strong that it literally shaped the content of Russian scientific fields and intellectual life. In the very hierarchical society of the Soviet 1960s, the intelligentsia more often than not disdained the masses, who seemed to have made the worst features of communism possible. Both the 19th and 20th century incarnations of the intelligentsia perpetuated an obsession with the West, a kind of superiority and inferiority complex combined. But the role of ideology was very different. The codified systems of ideas, those could never be the same after Stalinism, after the totalizing push to ideologize culture under Stalin. And by the same token, the use in relation to violence. Even in the era of 1905, the liberal constitutional Democrats did not condemn revolutionary terrorism. After Stalinism, intellectual approbation of violence simply could not be the same. So as Zubok shows, the Soviet system helped produce major differences between the old and new intelligentsias. The thaw era intelligentsia was also the product, in a sense, of the mass campaign for culturedness or kulturnost under Stalin and the vast Soviet expansion of higher education. You could not conceive of the multi-million readership of Novy Mir, for example, before that kind of expansion of the intellectual classes. In terms of values, the asceticism of the old intelligentsia, which survived through the 1920s, was replaced, starting in the late Stalin era, style apers, as he called them, the styliagi, and the aficionados of Tarzan, the movie. This began a strand of utter fascination for Western consumer culture, for jeans, jazz, and everything else. Finally, in the 19th century, the intelligentsia was associated above all with the left, with opposition and the revolutionary movement. In the 20th century, the hegemony of communist left-wing ideology that had been ossified into a new bureaucratic conservatism allowed for an incipient nationalist wing of the intelligentsia to emerge. This is the wing of Solzhenitsyn, Gumilyov, Likhachev, to challenge the left within a divided intelligentsia big tent. This is a big part of the story, as you can gather from Vlad's initial comments. And the two wings could take part in this revival of the intelligentsia. They could even take part in the same literary journal, Novy Mir, which was edited by Twardovsky, who had a foot actually in both of the camps. So all these continuities and discontinuities are extremely suggestive. And one thing I wished for was a more systematic attention to the conceptual history of the term intelligentsia, which has been so well researched in the 19th century, but much less so in the period we're talking about. And I wonder also, and here I'm moving towards my conclusion, that whether the comparison between the Tsarist and the Soviet intelligentsias that I've been talking about might shed some light on the book's conclusions about the long post-1960s decline of the intelligentsia, what Zubok calls the death of the Russian intelligentsia. And of course, as he mentioned, the book's title, The Last Russian Intelligentsia, implies that it exists no longer and probably will no longer exist again. Conditions of free market and freedom, as he says, were not good to the intelligentsia, the very notion of which, or maybe I should say the brand of which has been discredited in the post-Soviet period. In Zubok's words, there also remained no visionary vanguard promoting enlightenment and reform. There was also no cultural underground, the networks, the Khrushchev and Campania that were so crucial to the intelligentsia's existence. So the book's conclusion associates the death of the intelligentsia with loss of optimism and idealism and a loss in this faith in progress and the enlightenment of the people. but some of those old intelligentsia values, such as, I mentioned, faith in the people, had already been modified in the late Soviet period, decades before the intelligentsia was consigned to the grave. And I wonder if the 15 to 20-year hiatus between the heyday of the new intelligentsia in the 1960s and its great reactivization around 1987 under perestroika, it's a lot of what the book has to deal with, doesn't mean that in the right conditions the Russian intelligentsia might rise again in another incarnation. If the moral mission of the intelligentsia, its quest for truth and perfection and self-perfection, its quest for change by means of culture, is seen as a style of thought that can become connected to certain kinds of social engagements, then that style of thought is already part of the fabric of Russian culture. Now, one theory which was expressed by Katerina Clark last year at the Slavic conference at a panel we had on the intelligentsia was that if the intelligentsia is the product of the era of the written word, then perhaps it has already come to a close in the era of the internet. But I wonder if so many, uncanny reincarnations have occurred already in Russian history, such as the reincarnation of the 19th and 20th century intelligentsia, or the reappearance of the intelligentsia in the 20th century, and these reoccurrences in Russian history are due to a potent combination of a kind of cultural heritage that is rediscovered and to certain persistent conditions. So I wonder, and Pasternak's poetry in Dr. Zhivago expressed a strong belief in resurrection, which held such power that, as he wrote, death itself shall be destroyed.
Thank you very much for these very thoughtful, perhaps slightly more optimistic comments. Eric.
Well, this is really a fine book on a fascinating topic, and I think everyone in this room probably knows...
Microphone.
Sorry, is it... Everyone in the room probably knows members of the Soviet and post-Soviet intelligentsia, and thus all of us have strong opinions on it. So I'm going to try to restrain myself so we can turn to discussion. But I think it'll be hard because, this debate about the Russian intelligentsia has been going on for a very long time. In fact, it's exactly 100 years ago this year that the Veki controversy broke out in Russia, where many of the leading members of the intelligentsia criticized the very concept of intelligentsia and predicted, and I think many of them would have wanted, the end of the intelligentsia. And I think we can agree that reports of its demise then were exaggerated, and it perhaps may well be the case going forward that the same thing may well be true. In fact, I mean, if you want to start a lively discussion or argument in a post-Soviet kitchen, you could probably just say the word intelligentsia and leave, and 3 hours later you could come back, and I'm sure the debate would still be going on. I think it was about 2 years ago, upstairs, one of the charter members of the Washington, D.C. intelligentsia, Anatol Levin, gave a very provocative speech, essentially blaming the post-Soviet intelligentsia for a lot of Russia's contemporary problems. So the debate clearly goes on, and I suspect this might be one of the reasons why Vlad chose this very fruitful topic. Well, let me turn in a slightly different direction now and just ask the question, what kind of book is this, and what kind of author is this? Well, the best way to I always find the best way to sort of categorize an author in a book is to go back to Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he said that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Well, having read this book, I can say with full confidence that Vladislav Zubok is a fox. That is the great strength of this book, is its range, incredible range, from cybernetics to physics to politics to art, literature, music, putting all of it in the context of not only domestic history and politics, but also international history. It's a real tour de force, and I think it's a kind of book that very few people could write or even conceive of writing, and it's an amazing accomplishment what Vlad has done to pull it off. But it does raise the question, if there are hedgehogs out there, and there are, what would you want them to take away from the book? What is the one big thing in this book that people should take away? Now, let me see if I can raise a few issues for discussion by dwelling a bit on the concept of intelligentsia writ large. The book is really a eulogy for the intelligentsia, and it claims explicitly, and I think I kind of hope inaccurately, that the intelligentsia is gone and lost forever. But let me start, before I get into a discussion of the intelligentsia, let me start by, as maybe I've been teaching for too many years, but I'd like to give some reading suggestions. Maybe in the spirit of what happens when you go to Amazon.com and you find an interesting book and it says, you reader profile, you should buy this book along with it, right? The companion book. I haven't done your Google or your Amazon search to see what pops up. But here are the three that I would put in if I were in charge of Amazon. The first is, obviously, Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. This is one of the great novels of all time. I think, unfortunately, I didn't have time this week to reread it. It's been 20 years since I read it, and I still remember how it swept me away. It is an incredible, incredible novel with incredible depth. And I also remember that it was the second time that I read it that I really understood the full depth and complexity of it. And one of the great things about this book is its title. It's the metaphor that it uses and the focus on this wonderful novel. So let this be a stimulus to all to revisit this great novel. The second one is a book by Olga Grushin called The Dream Life of Sukhanov. What it does is fills out this discussion of the intelligentsia in Zubok with a long analysis of the terrible moral dilemmas of the intelligentsia, the terrible choices that members of the intelligentsia faced from the 1950s onward. And it gives a very, very palpable sense of the costs of the choices that these individuals had to bear when they made certain choices. And the third is Lyudmila Alexeyeva's The Thaw Generation, which is a memoir of many of the characters in this book, including herself, that I think is and remains one of the great primary sources on Zhivago's children, really. I mean, it's an amazing story. So you all have your homework. Now let me turn to the whole question of the intelligentsia, and what I'd like to do is just do kind of an exercise. The concept of the intelligentsia, of course, was born in Russia. It's a concept that Russia gave to the world. It emerged as a entity in the 1840s, even though the term actually only emerged in the 1860s, and evolved throughout the 19th century. And there are many different definitions, and any scholarly analysis, and there are many, 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 has a sort of section that debates the term and its definition and et cetera. And if you'll forgive me, I'll just kind of summarize my understanding of what the basic six elements of the intelligentsia in the 19th century were. So this, in essence, is kind of a primer on the 19th century criteria for membership in the intelligentsia. What were the things that characterized this group? First is individuals had to be critical of existing reality. First and foremost, of course, political, but also social and economic reality. Second, a member had to be dedicated to serving the people, the narod, through political action, through education and enlightenment, or for many in the 19th century, trying to understand the sort of metaphysical laws that govern society. The third was a sense of alienation from the existing political order, although often also a sense of alienation from the people, which was very painful and a constant source of self-reflection for members of the intelligentsia. The fourth would be a sort of acceptance of a basic utilitarian approach to political views, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. This derives from the great literary critic of the 1840s, Vissarion Belinsky, his idea that art had to serve a larger political goal, and the notion that later in the century, as political movements began to emerge, that revolutionary violence is justified in pursuit of a goal. The fifth characteristic would be positivism, that is a sense that religion and theology and metaphysics, to a certain degree, were all to be replaced by a scientific, rational way of thinking. a sort of I mean, even those like the Slavophiles who explicitly endorsed a Christian or religious worldview made their case in the language of secular metaphysicians of Hegel and Kant and the like. And the sixth characteristic would be a kind of quasi-religious sense of dedication to the cause, to being an intelligent, a member of a social group, explicit social group. There's been a lot of recent scholarship on the intelligentsia as a social formation. Laurie Manchester wrote a really interesting book that deals with the phenomena of priests' sons and how priests' sons took their fathers' theological notions and translated them into their secular ideologies. So basically the key point is that the intelligentsia was defined by attitudes and by politics much more than by profession or occupation. Professors and artists and journal editors were not members of the intelligentsia if they were not, if they didn't share these six characteristics, and especially the first two: criticism of existing reality and dedication to serving the people. So this book, Vladislav's book, raised questions for me about the criteria for membership in the intelligentsia in the 1950s and 1960s. So what I'd like to do is just very briefly run through these criteria and see how they apply in the 50s through 80s. So were members of the intelligentsia critical of existing reality? Well, in this book, not entirely. I mean, there are many characters who appear in here who are members of the system. There are many who believe in communism. Certainly, being critical of communism or of the Soviet state per se was not a criteria for membership in the intelligentsia, at least as this book defines it. Now, perhaps the baseline in here is critical of Stalinism. That is one thing that just about every character who appears in this book shared. So that's number one. Number two is dedication to serving the people. Well, that is not so apparent, I don't think. There seems to be, in fact, kind of a counter principle, a sort of disgust with the idea almost of the language of utility that underlay socialist realism as a doctrine. There seems to be a kind of stronger commitment to aesthetics, truth, human rights, and other abstract higher ideals, but not with a very clear connection of those abstract higher ideals to the people. In fact, the popular misunderstanding or lack of respect for those higher principles was something, seemed to have been something of a problem for the intelligentsia. The lack of respect among the common people for that kind of, those kind of principles. The third, alienation. Well, this is clearly the case for a small minority of the politically active members in the intelligentsia, people like Lyudmila Alexeyeva and her circles, the people who really became actively engaged. But there is, I think, something is missing amongst most of the characters in this book, and in the intelligentsia of the 50s through the 80s. If you look at the 19th century, it's a constant preoccupation of all members of the intelligentsia, trying to overcome the sense of alienation between them and the people. It's something that drives them and tortures them, really, throughout the 19th century. And I don't see the same kind of focus or torture among the characters of the 50s through the 80s. What about utilitarian views? Well, it seems quite the opposite. In fact, the idea that art should serve some larger social purpose had been kind of stained by the socialist realist doctrine and by the co-optation, attempts of the regime to co-opt this. And instead, there are many of the examples sort of pick up the Silver Age Russian intelligentsia reaction against this old utilitarian notion, and pick up the belief that aesthetics can have value in and of itself, that art for art's sake is a value in and of itself. Finally, or the fifth, positivism. Here, I think this is one of the more complex themes and interesting themes, and I was very happy to see in this book a discussion of the scientific intelligentsia. The scientific intelligentsia is a very interesting group. There were members of it in the 19th century, but vastly more as a proportion of the intelligentsia. And what I'd like to sort of ask is, well, to what degree are scientists members of the intelligentsia? What portion of the scientific cadres are intelligentsia, and what are the characteristics that define their membership in it. For example, just to take a couple prominent examples, Kantorovich and some of the theorists of the 1960s who tried to develop input-output models and use computers to perfect the planning system. They were trying to make the system more efficient and, in a utopian sense, make it work better. So were they members of the intelligentsia? If you accept the notion that membership in the intelligentsia requires some sort of critique of existing reality, of the existing system, of the structure within which people exists, it's a question. And then another question comes from, Lauren Graham is one of the great historians of the scientific establishment in the late Soviet Union, and one of the themes that he repeats over and over is that the training system for scientists and engineers and the scientific intelligentsia in the Soviet Union was extremely narrow, intended to create narrow specialists rather than people broadly educated in the culture of science and in a more general sense, in an intelligentny way, as intelligenti. So I'd be very interested to see what your assessment of that might be, that general problem. And finally, the quasi-religious sense of belonging to a distinct social group. This is something that comes through extraordinarily clearly in something like Alexeyev's memoir, the small groups groups of friends, the dissidents, the people who relied on each other and felt, faced real sacrifices when they joined the underground movement. But many of Zhivago's children, many of the characters didn't go that far. They were sort of kind of okay, doing well. They were in Moscow. They weren't kicked out of the city. They were had sort of made their compromises in order to stay there. So that's a difference as well. So I guess this tour through the 6 features of the original 19th century intelligentsia suggests that the post-Stalin intelligentsia was something very different from the original 19th century version. I guess my personal inclination would be to draw the line on the first factor, the one of critical toward existing political reality. I'm not so sure that the true believers, the members of the establishment, those whose only criticism of existing reality was their attempts to perfect it, I don't know if they can really be considered members of the intelligentsia. But it's a question, and I'd like to see what you think about that. So one more question about the criteria for determining who is a member of the intelligentsia, and that is the issue of culture and cultural elitism. Because, of course, Russia has its own intelligentsia tradition, but there's another very strong one that's very different. That's the German tradition, Nietzsche, of course, being the high priest of it. The idea that membership in the intelligentsia is defined by Kultur with a capital K, that being cultured defines membership in the intelligentsia. That is, in other words, that the distance of members of the intelligentsia from the uncultured masses is what defined them as members. This is something that is antithetical to the 19th century definition of the Russian intelligentsia. But Silver Age philosophers, those critics, those who emerged at the turn of the century, they sort of embraced it to a certain degree. But in any event, there's a huge difference between defining membership in the 19th century as based on dedication to serving the people to a kind of 20th century definition that's based on distancing one's self-definition, one's level of culture from the common people. It's a complex question, of course, but maybe something to discuss a little bit. So I've thrown out a few questions about definitions. I guess the basic question is, what criteria do you think should be used to define members of the intelligentsia from the 50s through the 80s? Is it obvious when you see someone that they're a member or not, or just generally? How do we do this? How do we think about this? Well, I think I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank you, Eric, for this tour de force, and I think you can tell both of you are terrific teachers as well. Let me just recognize Blair Rubel, director of the Ken Institute, joined us a short while ago, And while I'm at it, this today is the third event that I'm sharing, and that is the easy part. It really means extremely hard work for my assistants, Christina Tertsieva in the back, and Tim McDonald, I think, is also somewhere around. So my thanks to them as well. With that, Vlad, would you like to respond to some of the questions, or shall we open?
Well, after all these, speeches that we gave, I would like the audience more to react. Yeah.
Excellent. Comments and questions. In Wilson Center tradition, please identify yourself. And since we're webcasting this live, please wait for the microphone. Yes, up front.
Małgorzata Glańska, the George Washington University. I have a question for Vlad. Do you, in your book, do you talk about the links between the Russian intelligentsia and those from Eastern Europe, and which ones, if any, had most influence or on the Russians and vice versa? So just the links between, not so much the Western idea, but the links between the Eastern European intelligentsia and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Good luck.
Svetlana Savranska, the National Security Archive. I wonder if you see the Soviet dissidents of the late 60s, 1970s as a somewhat special subgroup of intelligentsia, or how do they fit in? A lot of them were, of course, physicists and people like Lyudmila Alexeyeva and Yuri Orlov, and they were highly critical of the system, of course. They would fit more with the definition of the 19th century intelligentsia. Just especially now, having listened to Eric, I can see the differences so well. So how would you define that group and its place within the Soviet intelligentsia in general?
Thanks, Svetlana. Vlad, go ahead.
Okay. Many questions. First of all, I'm deeply thankful to the both commentators for raising the level of discussion and giving you the even broader picture. Speaking of foxes, this panel is full of foxes probably. We're still waiting for a hedgehog to come to enlighten us why we're still here. The most interesting question, of course, the comparison between the old intelligentsia as a social cultural phenomenon, an intellectual phenomenon of intellectual history, and what took place in after Stalinism. And here, I think, as any phenomenon, intelligentsia was born in Russia, evolved in Russia, and was reborn in the Soviet Union. Here I agree with both commentators. What however changed was that it was a second-hand intelligentsia, if I may use the word, or may even use the word a used intelligentsia, because after the age of totalitarianism, after the incredible, unprecedented violence of the first half of the 20th century, it would be naive to expect people reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, same great novels, coming up with the same set of attitudes towards people, towards government, towards big things in life. And that's what I found repeatedly. People from that extended generation, tried to find mentors among the old Russian intelligentsia. Practically in every group, in each group, you had such mentors. Akhmatov and Pasternak were mentors for the poets. Zubor, Timofeyev, Risovsky was a mentor of some geneticists. And Kapitsa to a certain extent, although he was a younger guy. And Landau were mentors for even younger fellows, and so on and so forth. There was a deliberate and sustained effort to rebuild that huge hole, I must add, unfortunately filled with corpses, a pit filled with corpses, with something that was a continuity of Russian culture and intellectual tradition. That's why, you know, I cite Brodsky's Nobel speech fittingly today. Of course, speak about the Nobel Prize. Brodsky speaks about his generation in these terms. We're trying to find, to relink the era before Auschwitz and after Auschwitz, and the Russian concept, the era before the Russian Revolution and Stalinism, and after Russian Revolution of Stalin. So that's a big task, and of course they operated, as Eric mentioned, and even more Michael mentioned, under incredible duress. By the way, Grushin, a novel I read and enjoyed and used, it really inspired me to write about the long decline of that group without judging them too harshly, because I spent some part of my life actually in Soviet environment and know how how uneasy it was to deal with moral ambiguity of many situations there. I would define intelligentsia above all by their relationship to the importance of culture and knowledge, and by the sense of, if you like, enlightened elitism. And in the case of the 19th century intelligentsia, it was what they regretted and mourned and tried to overcome by enlightening people, by enlightening the regime. They felt the burden of their exceptional educated cultural status. In the situation of the 50s and the 60s, I think those people had it as a more natural feature. I mean, speaking of people whom they had to enlighten, they were the people. Most of them came from the people. In fact, they regarded themselves as the best part of the people and regretted that the rest of the masses couldn't join them. But if not, you know, they were the people. Some of them even conceived themselves as the only Europeans in a non-European country, the only free people, going even further. I mean, language going even further. The only free people in the land of the serfs, in the land of the slaves. That naturally didn't help them with finding mass followings, to say the least. But it shows, and one should understand, that they regarded themselves to be of the people, because they came of age during the period of social upward, mobility and upheaval of unprecedented proportions. So they came from all the groups of the society. So that may help us to come up with a more fluid definition that would not look like, 10 commandments on the points when you admitted to the Communist International, 6 points where you admitted to as a member to the intelligentsia, but something more fluid, more looking like, using the metaphor of a comet, or the nucleus with the following, with less amorphous, more amorphous entourage, like they discovered the new ring around Saturn, right? So science develops. Back to the questions, more specific questions. Well, there was a question from Goshke about links to Eastern Europe. I'm amazed myself. And check the web, how many Poles listen to Akujava, and how many Akujava songs are translated into Polish. A terrific connection. In fact, this connection came before the infatuation with America and the West. It was infatuation with Poland and Polish culture. So my reviewers kept pushing me in that direction. My answer was, unfortunately, I have some limit in the book. I would love to go in this direction, but maybe a separate book should be written about this. And we will come up with many surprising things, especially for younger generations that don't know anything about it. These things. Sveta's question about how to situate the smaller group within the larger group. Well, on one hand, I was tempted when I was writing the book to treat the dissidents, those the brave souls, a few brave souls, as the true and genuine and real intelligentsia. That was my temptation. As one subchapter is called "Living the Intelligentsia's Ideal." It's about them. It's about about Alexeyeva and Sakharov and Bonner and all those group of human right defenders. By the way, for them, the membership in Intelligentsia was very clear. Alexeyeva says, if you read Novy Mir and hold the new issue of the journal under your arm, you're a member of the club. We recognize each other. So it was simple for Alexeyeva. If you don't read Novy Mir, you're not one of us. Sorry. That was the 60s. But I struggled with that temptation because first of all, the notion of membership was a hotly contested notion in the 60s. I mean, some people among the nationalists that I think Michael or Eric mentioned, where they believed that it's not required to be pro-Western liberal Democrat to be, the member of the intelligentsia. In fact, Likhachev had a slightly different notion about what intelligentsia was about. There are people on the right, on the nationalist right, who believed in aggregate terms that the intelligentsia is ruining Russia. And some of them who are still alive keep repeating that today. But there are many people who suggested that, there are different sets of criteria. And that was the most difficult part in defining where the research should stop. So I prefer to make it inclusive, to have a big tent, to look at the Novy Mir as the largest tent of all, where Twardowski naively wanted just to invite all great writers who speak truth from whatever the ideological or nationalist or non-nationalist perspective they did it. Invite them all under this tent. And of course he failed, Novy Mir was closed and so on and so forth. But for me it's perhaps what is still lacking in Russia today. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking about Russia today and Russia of the future, inclusiveness, tolerance, contestation without fighting. So that really influenced my preference for a more fluid, for more amorphous, perhaps, choice of the phenomenon.
Thank you. There's a question over here. Is that right? No? Okay. Then Jim Hirschberg and then Blair Rubel. Christina over here.
Thanks, Jim Hirschberg, former QUIP director. Vlad, I'm thrilled to see the book, and I have a question that is, again, sort of a naive, non-Soviet studies, Slavicist question. I remember 5 to 10 years ago when you were working on this was always conceived of as the Soviet 60s project. And implicitly, this was a counterpart to, of course, what was all well known about the American and the Western 60s, in terms of the tumult in music, culture, politics, society, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, to what extent, if at all, significantly, was this intelligentsia, which is obviously an intrinsically Russian phenomenon, aware of and or influenced by what was happening in the West during this tumultuous period of the 60s? And there's interesting anecdotal evidence. I'm reminded of the memoir of one of Gorbachev's translators remembering, playing the Beatles in the dorm at MGU and how that philosophy was so influential. To what extent can you give any kind of measurement to the influence of that sort of soft power coming over from the West?
Want to go ahead and answer that, and then we'll go to Blair.
Okay. It's actually it's a big topic, Jim. But since we have so little time, let me tell you that yes, the influence was enormous, and in those days it looked like officially Soviet population was indoctrinated against the United States, but it was much more easier back then for Voice of America and other voices that were placed here to beam on Russia and reach people's hearts over there than it is today. Uncontestably so. So Russians were prepared to love everything American, as they were prepared, sometimes in intelligentsia, to love everything Polish, for instance. It needs to be answered, of course, why, what changed and why changed during. I think it changed during the 90s. This new anti-Americanism, in terms of placing Russian Russian intelligentsia into the history, the world history of the 60s. In 1968, people believed that the only Russian response to the great movements of the 60s was sending the tanks to Prague. And nothing can be said about that, of course, except for 7 brave souls that went out to the, actually more than 7, but 7 were arrested, protesting the invasion on the Red Square. Nobody carried, flowers. Nobody, confronted the police. There was no movement. But in fact, you may say, if you take a broader history of Russian cultural intellectual movements from Stalin's death, especially including 1956 and the late 50s and early 60s, you can find a place for Russian extended 60s in the history of global 60s. It was a classic case of asynchronic movements in history. Certain things happened, in fact, in Moscow a little bit earlier. Protest against bureaucracy, trying to save socialism from bureaucracy. What students from Sorbonne in Paris and Cohn-Bendit, all of them protested in 1968, took place to a certain extent in less violent the conditions of the Soviet rule in 1956. So that's what I'm trying to show in this book. But there's some coincidences as well as differences between the extended Soviet 60s and the Western 60s. Believe in science. Believe in the ability of science to change life. The influence of Soviet, as we learned, Soviet science fiction film director Khrushchev on Kubrick and other, similar production in the West. That great belief that humanity will travel in space and, humanize itself and change its fate, and so on and so forth. The impact of nuclear weapons, again, topical subject today to discuss. A huge impact that you have basically Soviet physicists warning the leaders about the possible end of civilization back in 1954. So you can find, and of course they continue to do so, and Sakharov is famous for developing it into the whole theory of convergence and the role of global intelligentsia in saving the mankind. So you can find many more links than you initially see. Sorry for speaking so long.
Thank you. Blair.
It's a great book. It's one of those books I put down and I thought to myself, boy, if I could only write a book like this. It really is quite something. The story you tell largely takes place in Moscow. Not solely, but it's largely a Moscow-based story in which the characters quite often come from outside of Moscow. And what's very interesting about the period of the 50s and 60s is the way in which Moscow attracts people from across the Soviet Union, and they live out a different life in the capital. If you fast forward to Perestroika and the Gorbachev period, you can make an argument that a big part of the story didn't happen in Moscow at all. It happened in Kiev, it happened in Lviv, it happened in Kazan, it happened in Vilnius, in Tartu, in Tallinn. And in fact, a lot of the people who a generation before looked to Moscow to find an expression of their alienation and discomfort with society were now looking elsewhere. How did that process play itself out, and how important was that to the fact that we now have a post-Soviet intelligentsia instead of a Soviet intelligentsia?
Thank you.
Well, Blair, thank you for your kind words. First of all, you're kind of placing I think quite smartly, placing a thesis that I disagree with. The post-Soviet intelligentsia does not exist. It's, if I believe in my own title, I shouldn't say that. So today the dynamics are completely different. You're absolutely right. People in Kiev and even Kharkov. By the way, people from Kharkov used to look up to Moscow. Now they look elsewhere. It's a different world that should be analyzed by other kinds of great books should be written. But under the Soviets, the way Moscow was constructed, the way Moscow was meant to be, proved to be both portentous and fatal for the Soviet regime. The fact that it was first the fourth Rome, then it was a window to the world, not only the West, the window to the world, more than a Potemkin village, much more than a Potemkin village. The way that 30,000 students were invited in Moscow in 1957. There were Tchaikovsky musical competitions. There were constant stream of world-renowned writers. Like I'm just rereading a book about Robert Frost coming in 1962 to Russia. You see all these, constant influences. Moscow was privileged, super privileged, to such an extent that the former cosmopolitan capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, paled so much in comparison, and a huge number of cultured people, intellectuals, scholars from St. Petersburg, Leningrad, of course, called at that time, moved to Moscow. So Moscow was the magnet. And you mentioned Gorbachev. Gorbachev figures prominently in this book as the person who was poisoned, quote-unquote, by Moscow from 1952 to 55, then had to leave for Stavropol, stayed there with his wife, who was also poisoned by Moscow cultural atmosphere. And for the next decades, they, I guess, surreptitiously or consciously wanted to get back. And they did in 1978. And the first thing that Raisa Gorbacheva did, she tried to reestablish contacts to her classmates from the same dorm where all those debates of 1953, 54, 55 took place, and they were sociologists, art historians, and all those. And moreover, she reached to other intellectuals trying to, and it was a sincere effort not to be basically a Soviet Jacqueline Kennedy. It was she essentially who reached out to academician Likhachev and invited him to do what he wanted to do, and he created a terrific, cultural foundation that helped thousands of people. So, I mean, it is the influence of Moscow, and I'm from Moscow. I'm not ashamed of it.
Thank you. Yes, over here to the right. Please wait for your microphone. Wait for the microphone.
Sergei Markov, Voice of America, retired. And this is obviously a topic that's of interest to me. You mentioned the Voice of America. How do you assess the influence of Western broadcasts on the intelligentsia, on the society? Was it peripheral, or was it central, or something in between?
Well, it has been assessed in literature, in many books, of course. And it was a very important part of their lives. Есть обычай на Руси ночью слушать BBC. Do I need to translate? It was essentially an alternative source of data, information that some of them took critically. Most of them began by listening to music and then continued with political news. But it led that nucleus of them who dealt with human rights to use Western media, and now some terrific work is being done on that confluence between those few dissidents and their support groups. Behind each dissident, active dissident, was a support group, sometimes of hundreds of people. We shouldn't forget that. Without this soup, they wouldn't have existed, those dissidents. But all of them were looking forward to Western journalists, not only from VOA, but some preferred still left press, like Giulietto Chiesa from Italian, communist press. Others who completely broke with communism preferred, those in good standing, like Hedrick Smith, guiding them around the suburbs of Moscow, showing the life of elite and how poor live and so on and so forth. That was a huge and very important aspect in their lives that I guess, how to say, I may be completely wrong. Instead of their longing to reunite with the Russian people, came the longing to reunite with Western media.
Yes, in the center.
Thank you. Leonard Oberlander. I want to ask this because it seems there has not been any awareness or recognition of it, as is discussed in the Soviet intelligentsia. Was there any recognition or interest towards China? The events in China that occurred after 1949 and then the Cultural Revolution, was this part of the intelligentsia's assessment, or was it strictly pointed towards the West?
No. Thank you for your question. Above all, it's a very important question. China and then Middle East progressive Arab regimes, and then Africa, liberated Africa, were very important correctives. And then Cuba, of course, above all, Castro's Cuba, very important correctives to that exclusive monodimensional pro-Western orientation among those intellectuals. China first, first of all, tens of thousands of young specialists traveled to China and worked there from 1950, 51, and especially after the end of the Korean War, and it ended, of course, abruptly in 1960. Fascination with another example of working socialist society where socialism had a promise. It was very, very important. I mean, even in Bonner's biography, I was surprised to discover that she lived for a year in Iraq and worked there as a physician to help the Iraqi people under Qasim to deal with various diseases. And she came back with mixed feelings, but most important was that it was the ability to compare Soviet society, whatever was called socialism, of Soviet type with other societies where socialism existed as a slogan or a promise, and so on and so forth. So that that ability to compare, I think, was the strongest part of the new cohort that I analyzed. But of course, not all of them had that opportunity to travel, unfortunately, and that constrained them to some extent. What is interesting, while even they traveled, they continued to be, while they enjoyed the consumerist benefits of the countries that they visited, many of them remained anti-capitalist for quite a long time. That's an interesting observation that I made.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but Marty, right.
Hi, Vlad. This is a follow-up question, I think, to the last one and the one about Voice of America. How did the intelligentsia square the circle between their interest, positive interest in Western things, culture, etc., and American policies towards Cuba, towards certain parts of Africa, and to China?
Well, intelligentsia didn't think in one way. It was not a collective brain even of any kind. There is a variety of opinions, but I think many people in 1960-61 fell in love with Castro and sincerely, genuinely worshipped the Cuban Revolution. At the same time, they fell in love with Kennedy. I cannot
fully square that.
I cannot square the circle. I cannot explain it. It's just one of those phenomena that was perhaps irrational, that could not be rationalized fully. Yes, they loved Kennedy as much as people from West Berlin, and yes, they loved Castro too. Not all of them, of course, but many of them.
Thank you. Eric, Michael, do you have any?
Well, I just want to raise a couple of points that have come up in the course of this very interesting discussion. One is, I think that we have to think about the role of the state here. How important to creating this intelligentsia is a repressive state. I think in all the cases we discussed, it was extremely important. But there's also a kind of there's a struggle for authority. There's a struggle for power and privilege in a lot of the professions. There's a struggle for autonomy, especially starting in the 1950s, to carve out their own independent spaces. So this is crucial on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a kind of symbiosis with the state. And here we were talking about alienation. I think in many ways alienation has been overestimated for the 19th century. And you look, when did that come into our scholarly literature? It came in the 1960s with Pipes and Martin Malia. And perhaps they wanted to, it would be interesting to find out if they wanted to really distinguish the official Soviet definition with an earlier opposition. But in any case, a lot of recent scholarship is showing that intellectuals were not, they may have talked about themselves as alienated, but where did they work? Where did they get their money from? There was a relationship there. And in the case of even the dissidents, who were the most alienated in that they had completely broken with official Soviet politics and culture, the recent work of Barbara Walker showing that they had some parts of their mentality could really be called Soviet. And so it's a very complicated issue here.
I just wondered how many of them were party members.
And were the intelligentsia only oppositionists? Well, can you really say that Dostoevsky was not a member of the intelligentsia? Well, he would have said no, but if you think of it, it's also involving styles of thought and attitude, and he would, of course, was asking the cursed questions.
Thank you. I think this was an afternoon in the best of Wilson Center tradition, from deep scholarship and concerns about the 19th century to issues that are intensely relevant to today's world and certainly today's Russia. Thank you, but most of all, congratulations to Vlad on this wonderful book, and thank you to Eric and Michael for two wonderful, terrific comments. Thank you. Please join us for a glass of wine outside.